I think school back then, it was taken much more seriously.
It's more corrupted than back then.
That I think now people are playing and stuff like that, they're taking education for granted.
But these days, school is freedom. I enjoy it.
Sometimes those people don't get
Nowadays, you find that a person who's doing about maybe grade 11 can't read English very well as compared to a person who was doing grade 11 back then.
Education in South Africa did not start with colonization. Long before Jan van Riebeeck established the first formal school for black slaves in 1658, the people of the South had their own modes of teaching.
In understanding education in South Africa today, you have to understand it in its historical context.
When we deal with education in Africa, in pre-colonial times, the first thing was what was called self-knowledge. You have to understand yourself, understand your relationship with your family, with the community, and also understand your duties and responsibilities. Now, the other thing is, human survival depends on nature. So children would be taught to master nature itself, understand it. You will hear that people say they sit around the fire, they tell stories. And those stories were not just stories, they were actually lessons. And that's why initiation for both boys and girls would be compulsory.
By the late 1700s to 1925, the missionary schools were set up all over Southern Africa as a way of civilizing and spreading the gospel.
Prior to apartheid, where education was really driven by faith communities, in particular missionaries.
I attended school in a church school.
I started it was then called Dom A or some Standard A. It was in a church. What used to happen in Alex, most churches were schools.
Started by sub A there, and of which my brothers also attended school. They attended the very same school, and it was a sort of a family school to us.
Because the history is that because government didn't want to do anything for Alex, the community started its own initiatives. Now there are individuals in the community who started churches, and after that, it became quite clear that they must go forward in terms of establishing further schools.
It wasn't just an easy thing to attend school, because the other regulation was that you have to wait until you are 7 years old. And in the meantime, no crutches, nothing. We had no books. We used slates And then we had one reader, Munzamaisa Visiho for sub A, and it was prescribed from sub A, and then sub B had its own Munzamaisa Visiho, Senate 1 Munzamaisa Visiho. And we had also the government readers, English. It had that, sub A, B, and then Senate 1. But otherwise, the teaching was okay.
That was a period of high quality. It was a period where the missionaries were trying to produce the best quality of people who could take forward their project, who saw it as a way of reaching people that they wished to convert and civilizing through education.
The graduates of mission schools at the time were forced to go overseas to places such as England and the US to continue their higher education, which turned higher education into a privilege only few could afford. The Higher Education Act of 1916 saw more universities emerging from within South Africa, such as UNISA and Fort Hare. But race was still a determining factor on who could study where and what.
When the National Party came to power in 1948, they believed that you could use education to contain and to control and to direct people's potential.
We had that feeling that there is going to be a change in government and also a change in education.
With the formation of the Union of South Africa, the British tried to placate the Afrikaners by investing more in educating the white. By 1945, the government was spending £3 to educate the black child, £10 for the Indian and coloured child, and £38 for the white child. The National Party took over government in 1948 and accelerated policies of race division.
And they introduced a system which was called Bantu education by themselves and had, many people would argue, the conscious intention of producing inferiority.
John Forster's infamous Senate House speech stated, "The Bantu must be guided to serve his own community in all respects. There is no place for him in the European community, above the level of certain forms of labor. Within his own community, however, all doors are open. Until now, he has been subjected to a school system which drew him away from his own community and misled him by showing him the green pastures of European society in which he was not allowed to graze."
There were very famous speeches made in Parliament. The Green Pasture speech is one of the ones that's quoted most often, where in Parliament one of the parliamentarians said, "What is the good of teaching an African child mathematics? They have no use for it."
There wasn't much to compare Bantu education with. You could not compare Bantu education to any other education because it was just after a transition of the old Cape, Transvaal, Free State education.
Communities and church organizations tried resisting Bantu education, realizing that the system would continue to relegate Africans to nothing more than cheap labor.
When Bantu education was introduced, there was resistance, and very strong resistance in urban areas.
We were given the syllabus and we had to teach the school curriculum then.
The churches were then faced with a very difficult decision. The Bantu Education Act prescribed syllabi which the churches felt were inferior and did not produce excellence. And they had to decide to either deliver that curriculum or refuse to deliver that curriculum and close down. And some churches chose to close their schools rather than be involved with Bantu education. Other churches said some education tactically is better So Bantu education was then implemented as the apartheid grand plan unfolded, and it moved from the education of children in the urban areas to the creation of the Bantustans, and each Bantustan accepting responsibility for education in that so-called independent part of South Africa.
By the late 1960s, students were becoming more militant in their demands. More African states were gaining independence, and in 1969 saw the birth of South African Student Organization with Biko as its president. The education inequalities were so bad that by 1970, for every 1 rand the government spent on a black child, it would spend 31 rand on a white child. Change was on the winds.
The objective of the ANC from 1916, when the ANC was banned, was to set up an exile structure that would campaign internationally against apartheid. Oliver Tambo, the then vice president of the ANC, was sent overseas to establish the exile wing of the ANC. For example, the boycott movement escalated, the cultural boycott, the economic boycott, the academic boycott. They were all very successful.
The now famous uprising of June 16 marked a decisive move by young people. The no to Afrikaans was also no to the system, its education and social constructs. Suddenly, the ANC camps in the frontline states were flowing with young people willing to fight the system. Some chose the AK-47 and joined the MK, and some chose the pen and joined Samafco.
When one thinks of that day, June the 16th, that's when everything changed.
We need to understand that if we look at the continent as a whole, there was a movement towards independence. There was a sense of freedom. After there was a policy change in the Department of Bantu Education, that African children needed to study some of their subjects in Afrikaans. The resistance to that gave rise to the Soweto riots. The Soweto riots spread throughout the country. It's incorrect to call them the Soweto riots because they're the 1976 uprisings, and they took place around the country.
We saw children coming in from Naledi, Thabo High School, Thomas Mufolo coming in, and then the primaries were not so much affected, but they were dismissed. Now the people who were doing it, high schools, were the ones that were up front. And I remember when they came in, the children just had to give in and join in and go up with the throng. In 1977 January, we were to start schooling. Some students came in, they had no transfers. We did not even know when they have passed any proof of passing the standard. So we had to start afresh and accept whatever they are telling us. And then I remember having a 16-room class and having 8 classrooms of those people who are doing a JC.
The police repression in response to the 1976 riots meant that large numbers of young people left the country and joined liberation movements outside of the country.
The Solomon Mahlangu Freedom College, Samafco, was established on the old Sisal farm donated by the Tanzanian government to the ANC in Morogoro, Tanzania. Originally, the college was set up as a secondary school to take in the high volumes of young people as a result of the uprising of 76. It was later named after Solomon Mahlangu.
Yes, can you Solomon Mahlangu?
I know the name, but I don't know the person.
He was one of Batban, and something. What is it?
Who is Solomon Mahlangu? I don't know.
Is ke motho o na lwela halefo na lwela for re be le freedom mo lefatsheng ka di 90s.
The ethos of SAMAFCO was basically education with a purpose. The purpose here being to prepare young people to serve in the new South Africa and to show what society can be created in a new South Africa without Bantu education, sexism and racism. International funding came from Nordic, European, African countries as well as UNESCO. The teachers also came in from these various countries.
I arrived at SAMAFCO in 1979 as part of a group of young people who were requested by the leadership of the ANC to go help establish the college.
While I was in London, I had a telex message from Comrade Alfred Nzo, who was the Secretary General of the ANC based in Lusaka. He said that the NEC had appointed me director of SAMAFCO.
The role at SAMAFCO was at two levels. The one level was for me to act as a teacher. I was teaching biology to those that had not yet completed their secondary education. And the second role, obviously, was also to be part of the basic leadership structure, where we had to organize the life of South Africans in SAMAFCO.
This college, or rather the idea behind this college, was to prepare the South African youth, deprived of so many opportunities inside the country, to prepare them to play a role not only in our struggle, but a role in future.
Well, we found SAMAFCO pretty much a bare farm with very rudimentary structures in the form of houses, which we converted into classrooms.
At first I was doubtful whether I was qualified enough to be a director, but I said that I would serve initially for 2 years until they found somebody who was more experienced. They said, no, it's all right. You have enough experience, you go over and become director.
So as part of our livelihood, we had to also make do with what was available in and around the area.
Growing our own food as much as we could. In the tailoring factory, we made costumes for students. In the furniture factory, we made the desks and chairs, beds for the students. So we became self-reliant. That was the whole idea, that in exile we should have an institution which relied on itself. Because the growth of the ANC exile population escalated quite rapidly after 76. So they weren't just students who were coming into exile, but adults too. Adults who, some of them came out with their families. Some of them married in exile and began to start families. So we needed a nursery school, a primary school, a secondary school, which was the biggest element of the SAMAFCO. Adult education center.
What made it not an ordinary school is that we knew that there were other ways to get liberated. You could either use your gun to get liberated, or you could use your pen. So basically anyone who took the decision to be at SAMAFCO was going to liberate their country through their pen.
It was essentially to teach South African our history, our politics, and the resistance that go with it.
We wanted a curriculum that created a new person, a new South African who would be non-racial, non-sexist, and democratic in disposition. He also wanted a curriculum that was the very opposite of Bantu education.
And that course was formulated by the ANC Policy Department in Lusaka, discussed with the teachers, and of course implemented in the college.
So it was about decolonizing the mind.
So we had a combination of support from various social solidarity movements in Europe, in America. Well, with that help, we were able to, by 1985, establish almost complete the whole project.
Education was just something that one would wish to have, but in terms of going forward to the future, there was no plan. I mean, I think that's the system of education, the way it was created, to ensure that we don't have certain ambitions as people. I did my schooling in Alexandra Township.
I literally did all my secondary schooling in Somafco. The thing about Somafco is that the classes were small. You got the attention that you actually needed. You got the best resources.
At that time, I recall there was lots of police, and between 76 and 79, the repression was still there. When we went to school, we went under those circumstances, and of course it was education, and one was being lackadaisical and saying that I want to go to school, and after school I'm hoping to get some job.
Where in my secondary schooling I had a long bench with only one of my classmates, just the two of us. Textbooks galore, teachers who were highly qualified with a doctorate teaching a high school.
For an example, I hated maths. Firstly, because most teachers that were teaching us maths were teachers who were very brutal in terms of corporal punishment.
There were no boundaries, so you could get out of it what you put into it.
Of course, you know, when one began to be conscientized that the education we were getting was inferior, then you start to be sort of cynical about what is happening regarding that. It is for this reason that some of us decided to join COSAS, because it was based on a view that we need to change this kind of education.
It was a practicality of defying what Bantu education was trying to do to a South African child.
The school subjects were accredited via the London General Certificate of Education Board and the ANC Exam Board. The subjects were a mixture of sciences, maths and political studies, with the strong extramural program geared at reinforcing a South African identity.
The most compelling moment of my life at Somafco was when Somafco was under alert. So as students, we had to prepare ourselves for such a moment, which meant that we had to dig trenches from behind our rooms. We were there because that's what it meant. We were going to sacrifice our lives to be free, but we were going to do it through the pen. And we would dig those trenches, we would go to the mountains, and when it felt safe, every single day we went back to school. We didn't think, oh, we're under alert, therefore school should not continue. We woke up at 5, we went to the mountains, we hid, we came back at 9. We took our showers, we went back to school, and we're still going to fight for this liberation through our pens.
The college ran from 1979 to 1989 and was handed over to the Tanzanian government by 1992. The emphasis on maths and sciences saw the college producing a lot of professionals. The idea was that the lessons learned in Samafco would be translated into the new education system of South Africa.
In 1985, a major event happened in Soweto, and that was that a group of activists, responsible parents, decided to convene the Soweto Education Crisis Committee to look at the issue of what was happening in education in Soweto, because at that stage there was an expectation that if we intensified the struggle against apartheid, we would very soon be free.
I think the environment changes, that you are no longer a kid, you are sort of grown up, then you start to be inquisitive.
The work of the Soweto Education Crisis Committee was critical at that stage, and it was a moment that changed the history of education in South Africa, because it coincided in 1985, 2 years after the launch of the UDF.
We could see that UDF movement that was the one that was steering the course.
There was a recognition that we needed to mobilize within schools, that we needed to bring together the key constituencies of parents, teachers, and students to work together to make sure that, and this is often misunderstood, that schools became places which weren't abandoned to be sites of Bantu education, but became places where we used education to advance struggle in several ways. One was to resist the apartheid state, but the other was to deepen critical thinking and advance people's skills.
Of course, the long-term goal of COSAS was a free education for South Africans, and it is something that we believed in. But then we knew that there were short-term gains that needed to be accumulated before reaching that objective.
So the Soweto Education Crisis Committee was part of that broad democratic movement that was the UDF. And there was a conference in 1986 in Durban which brought together parents, teachers and students from across the country. It was addressed by the late Zwelakhe Sisulu. And it was at that conference that people adopted the strategy of saying that within our schools we need to advance the kind of critical thinking that will advance democracy and build the skills for our new South Africa. Of course, it was met by massive state repression, lots of detentions.
It became an onward process of being detained and released because of my activities in COSAS, and the school boycotts followed. That process prolonged, and it led even to some confrontation among students, but it was also punctuated by detentions and constant police harassment.
The success of the movement within the country of challenging apartheid and the issue of the armed wing of Umkhonto weSizwe and other military formations led to 1990 and the unbanning of political organizations.
South Africa achieved democracy in 1994, but this came with its own set of problems, some being carried over from the apartheid years, like unequal development of schools, teachers, and the lack of culture of learning within communities.
The government was shaky about the condition happening out in schools.
They were also considering how they could consolidate and advance their interests. So what they did in 1992 is that the House of Assembly, which was the parliamentary structure serving white people in this country, said to all of the white schools in the country, you've got several options that you can choose from in terms of your governance and financing framework. Number one, you can choose today to become a private school, and we'll give you the school. So in Johannesburg, I'm aware of 3 schools that said, thank you very much, we'll take the school. The second option they gave was that they said, we will let you stay as you are, but if the school parents vote to support this in a majority, I think it was probably a majority of more than 60%, you will be able to determine your own admission policy, and you would be allowed to admit children other than white children into your schools. The third option, which was called Model C, this was called Model B, this is Model C, is that you'll continue to be a public school, you'll have to raise some of the money yourself, but you'll be able to admit who you want. So there were 3 models. Later, Piet Klauser, who was the minister, took away all the other models and said you'll all be Model C. So that was an attempt to be able to move control of schools away from the new state that was coming and make it more tightly in the control of local communities, which were presumed to be majority white.
We started seeing a ray of hope that things were changing.
So the next period is 1990 to 1994. What is very critical about that period is that the ANC was then able to develop its policy proposals in education, drawing from work in South Africa.
SOMAVCO was meant to be a prototype of an education center which we thought could assist us when we returned back at home to come and set up a model that we would have tested out there.
The ANC was very, very preoccupied with coming to a political settlement at Kodesa. And education wasn't a major priority.
When we returned back home, various people then had to take various capacities back home here. The current Minister of Education was part of the Education Policy Unit in KwaZulu-Natal at the University of Natal, Durban campus.
Work was done to produce a set of education policy proposals.
The long-term vision of those that funded policy from the beginning has always been to improve the education system.
They tried quite hard to try and infuse the importance of the education policy systems. They remain very committed in coming up with solutions on how we can actually set up an education system in South Africa.
I think that to this day, many people don't understand the complex situation that we faced in 1994. One of the biggest challenges in 94 was the fact that all of the education departments had different curricula, different syllabi. There were 18 or so education departments in the country, and the geography of those education departments didn't match the new geography. So on the 27th of April 1994, there were 4 provinces in terms of white South Africa. So there was the Cape, there was Natal, there was the Orange Free State, and there was the Transvaal. On the 29th of April, after the elections, you now had 9 new provinces. And those provincial boundaries were not the same as the boundaries of the education departments. The first MEC for Education in Limpopo was Arnold Matsuleli. He had 9 departments or something to try and make a new department out of. And he had to share those departments with other people in what was the Transvaal. Can you imagine the complexity?
And ours was to come and establish one single national education system guided by policy and laws. But because we're inheriting an education system that was very divided, and we have systems and skills that are rather unequal, we are confronted with very difficult questions. First, the one question that we had to grapple with was the question of coming up with the national curriculum,
which was the same for all children across the country. And then we also had to think, what kind of curriculum should that be? Firstly, was common to everyone. Secondly, promoted particular values that were fundamental to what we needed in our new country. That was very confusing for teachers.
When education started changing, we had this problem of one discipline, and the number two were the change of the syllabus.
Teachers had been familiar with a very strict syllabus that said, this week you do this week you do this, 2 lessons on that, 3 lessons on that. And then we asked them to basically do a mix and match curriculum. What values would you like to promote in this lesson? What skills might you like to promote? What knowledge will you use to do that?
The policies themselves may not necessarily be bad, but they need to be seen through properly and implemented properly and monitored and evaluated. And then we change them when we realize that, or tweak them as it were, instead of changing them wholesale.
I mean, they are discouraging teachers in a way, because when a teacher is trying to find his foundation, then automatically education changes.
But I do know that teachers have felt confused. They felt just as they've begun to understand one innovation, as they've begun to get confidence, it's changed, and then they've got to catch up with a new one, and as they begin to get confident in that, it changes again, and then there's a new one.
We change policy without having the implementers of policy equipped to deliver and implement and realize this policy, and then we change again before we've even gotten anywhere with that.
But because of the change of the policies of education, then the resources that we had when we are supposed to add up is to remove them and start again. So that is also a waste of money on my side.
So every time, there's a view amongst teachers that every time there's a new minister, there's a new curriculum. There's a constant complaint and constant frustration that the relationship between parents and schools is not working. As schools experience parents as absent.
You ask your parent, does the child do homework? And then the parent will say, they are doing it at school because there are people who are helping them. And but if you check as a parent, you find some parents who will not check their children's homework.
The sense of the disconnect between schools and parents, I think, has to be mended. Because teachers are carrying too much of the burden themselves without feeling the support of the parents.
You call a parents' meeting. Instead of getting, we have got presently about 395 learners. But we won't get 395 parents in a school. That will be the day, I don't remember.
Teacher training is still a problem up until today.
Under the apartheid government, knowledge was seen as something that was very fixed, not to be contested, and had to be accepted and reproduced.
We copied all what our teachers used to teach, the way they taught us.
Teachers that were trained under apartheid education, one has to begin by reminding ourselves that these are intelligent, competent people, but who were not given access to an education that was truly empowering of them.
Teachers were well qualified, even up to today. I mean to say, those teachers produced doctors, nurses, lawyers, you name people, a type of job that you can get. Now, why all of a sudden now that we start losing confidence in them?
The nature of teacher education under apartheid in itself was not something that was intellectually empowering. It wasn't intended to be.
One telling tale about that, for instance, is in our communities. Very often in the communities that are failing, the schools are failing, you will very rarely find a teacher, an educator, bringing their child to that school where they are working. And only those parents who have no choice, who have no resources, who can't take their kids elsewhere, are forced to bring their kids to schools that are failing because they've got no choice.
The parents ask us to punish their children. Sasa, no. You should have seen.
In 1999, the TV series Yizo Yizo highlighted some of the challenges facing township schools, and one of them being discipline.
Department bans corporal punishment, but leaves the teacher with nothing to replace it.
One of the policy decisions taken forward in the South African Schools Act is that the South African Schools Act bans the use of corporal punishment.
There was this corporal punishment during our time, whereby you know that a child, when he's punished, he will do his job, he will do his work, he will study, because there's something that he fears. Today, children do not fear anything.
I cannot accept that an adult in a position of authority in a school situation should be permitted to use physical violence. I think it communicates entirely the wrong message. It says, because I am bigger than you and I have authority and you don't, I can hit you. It's completely logical for a teacher or a principal who beats a child. Why would they complain that when their child beats somebody smaller in the playground? It's the same principle.
There were no alternatives for disciplinary purposes.
I do accept that there are young people in our system who are deeply troubled, who behave in ways that are antisocial. A child who is so troubled is not going to be helped by more violence against that person. We desperately need, in our education system, the support of disciplines like social work.
In 2012, 18 years since 1994, education is still beset by challenges. The textbook delivery saga and the quality of the matric pass rate make one wonder, has South Africa learned from its history? Has the country made the changes it needs to deliver quality education to its children?
Children from our these poorer communities are having a raw deal in the new South Africa.
I think generally in South Africa there is a sense of disappointment in education. And that disappointment, I think, is because we know that so many children who are intelligent are not being given the opportunities that enable them to succeed.
We all know what we are confronted with, both in terms of functional schools, as well as in terms of results that we want out of our learners and our students. It's a major challenge. It's a challenge that we're grappling with. It's a challenge that sometimes put us off guard, but it's a challenge that we must deal with, and it's a challenge that we have to resolve.
You drove anywhere in the countryside during term time. You saw large numbers of students walking sometimes 10 kilometers or more or less to their school. No transport facilities were being provided for them. Now 18 years later, the situation is still the same. And I see that picture as depicting the failure of education of the system here for the poor child.
There has been certain achievements in education, such as the streamlining of departments, increase in budget for education, and food schemes. But what have we learned in the past 18 years that can be taken forward in bettering our education systems in the future?
we have, over the last 18 years, achieved quite a bit, quite a lot in the education system. But at the same time, we have made mistakes.
And you can extend that even further to say, our policy solutions very often have been imports from the Europes and the Australias and Americas.
For me, fundamental to that is the issue of language. I do believe that our children need to be able to become fluent in the languages of commerce, English, etc. But you can only learn in a language you understand.
For a normal education to prevail, I will not look at the education per se, but I will start at conditions that will make education to be successfully implemented.
Our teachers, we need professional teachers, qualified teachers, competent teachers, and then we need teachers who are committed to their work.
We need to start saying that the teachers are the greatest asset. We need to support them, we need to hold them, we need to encourage them, and we need to make sure that their commitment to education is sustained by the way that we hold them.
The challenge, however, is to get the education systems as they currently exist, primary education system, higher education system, as well as technical and vocational education system to function efficiently. It's a major challenge because to do that you need to have skills and expertise. To do that you need to have qualified and competent teachers. To do that you need to have very good managerial and leadership skills.
It's been 355 years since Jan van Riebeeck established the slave school in the Cape Colony. Looking at communities in the township and rural areas today, one can say the struggle to deliver quality education continues. It will take families and communities to make sure that quality education does not become a dream deferred for all of South Africa's children.
I wish to make an appeal to all those from South Africa who have enjoyed the facilities built up here. Use that knowledge which you have acquired here in the service of the people of South Africa. Do not seek to exploit for your personal benefit the opportunity which has been given to you by the efforts of your comrades in the struggle. Think always of what you can do to honor the memory of people like Solomon Mahlangu and the many thousands of others who have died fighting against apartheid.